So we are back from Arizona, and we've had time now to collectively make a decision on what we're going to do. And so we are going to basically walk through with you everything we saw that led up to our decision. So let's start with, what were you expecting in this property prior to us actually going and seeing it?
It was presented to us as a value add project, so we knew it was going to be in probably rough condition. And it was. The property had a lot of work that needed to be done. There was some hair on the deal, which is typical when we see a project. If a property is in a situation like this, if it's able to go to a bank or to a prime lender, it will. If it's coming to us, there's a reason. And so we knew that there was some hair on the deal when we went out and saw it. But overall, the risks that we saw on paper were risks we were willing to work with.
As we were going there, did you have a feeling that this was probably a project that we were going to fund?
Yeah.
Yeah.
By the time we quote on a loan, we've already done the paper underwriting, and there's usually several questions that we have for the borrower and his broker that aren't necessarily quite answered yet, but we've at least gotten verbal explanations on everything. So by the time we propose, we've already made a decision that if everything is as they've represented to us, this is a deal we're going to do. So by the time we get on a plane, we've already proposed, we've already gotten responses back on all of those questions, and really that's kind of one of our final steps to make sure that as we're going through the process of making sure that the things that they've told us are true.
So then going to the property, what did we see?
Well, we saw a value add project for sure. We went around and I don't know how much of it made it onto camera, but there were holes in the ceiling, and there was a rodent problem, and there was a lot of work that needed to be done. There were I recall one of the stairways was attached on one side but not the other, so it was in rough condition, but certainly not the worst we've seen. And I would say that the property was roughly in line with what we were expecting when we went out there, and so overall I think that the borrower had bought it right, and it was it definitely had potential to be a good project.
So we have a project that didn't scare us as far as the work that needed to be done.
Right.
The borrower bought it at the right price. What concerns did we start having aside from those two components?
Good question. So when we're looking at a project, there's really sort of two categories, if you will, that we're looking at. One, of course, is the property. Is this a property that we want to be involved with? And if the answer to that is no, then there's really nothing more to it, the analysis. But once we've established that this is a property that, if we had the ability to participate on the equity side, we would, well then, lending on it is almost a no-brainer. But we still have to look at another factor, and that's who's in charge, who's running this project. I've heard it expressed as, is the borrower willing and able to repay the loan? And that willing part is a big deal, because even with a good project, sometimes you just get borrowers who, for whatever reason, don't recognize the importance of making sure they pay their debts. And even with a good project, that can make it a really miserable experience. And so, so that's a big factor we're looking at, is that willingness and ability to repay. And in this particular case, when we got there, the property was pretty consistent with what we expected in terms of the condition of the property and the need for some value add. There were some things that, while we were there, we identified that weren't in the budget that they had presented to us. So, I guess it would be safe to say it was maybe a little bit rougher than what we expected, but not terribly so. I think the big issue was, as we're walking through and looking at these things, it wasn't it wasn't consistent with some of the things that they had told us. And one example, as we're standing there looking at rodents in, rodent traps on the floor, and the borrower's telling us that there's no pest issue. So little things like that. But overall, there were some things that the broker had represented as far as sort of the history on the project, and why the borrower was coming to us, and the condition of the sort of the total picture that proved to be false, and that's a really big deal. Along that willingness to repay, that's a trust issue, and as soon as that trust starts to break down, sometimes it gets to a point where even if you love the project, there's just no recovering from that, and that's kind of where we ended up on this project.
So we ended up deciding not to lend on it. And something you just said, which I think is really valuable to touch on, you used the rodent issue as, you're seeing all these traps, and do we have a rodent problem? No. Why don't you talk about the importance of not trying to hide things that are wrong, and that it's actually better to be transparent about everything and show that you have a plan in place, that you're capable of executing on that plan?
That's so important, because you get a lot of borrowers or prospective borrowers. And this happens on the equity side too, where they come to us and they want to try and paint a picture that is better than reality, and we're going to see through that. You might convince us while we're all sitting around a conference room table, but we're going to do our due diligence, and when we do, we're going to find the stuff that that they were trying to hide. And when they've been up front with us about it, the reality is if you present a piece of information, either we can get over it or we can't, okay? And if we can't, you'd rather know sooner rather than later, after we've spent a whole lot of time and some of your money in the due diligence process. So be upfront about it. We're gonna find it. The other piece to that is there's not much we haven't seen before, and if you're truly buying the project right, a rodent problem doesn't scare us. A stairway that's tilted doesn't scare us. These are things that can be fixed. So they're really not a big deal as long as you're buying it right. So the main thing I would say is be upfront about it. Like you said, show that you have a plan to deal with those problems. And those are non-issues. But when we start finding things and it's really obvious you're trying to hide them, or you don't want us to know about them, trust is broken and the deal's not going to happen.
Yep, that's right. So going out there and ultimately making the decision that we're not going to fund it, and the amount of time it took for us to do the due diligence on this project, and having to set aside the capital as if we were going to fund it, what does it look like that we weren't able to?
Yeah, that hurts. Like you said, we set aside the capital at the point where we make a loan offer, and that offer is accepted. When we make the offer, we have the capital to make the loan. We're not one of those shops that makes an offer and says, and we'll try, on a best efforts basis to bring in the money to do this. We actually set aside the money and give you a few days to think it over and respond. And if you actually sign up, then we keep that money separated for this project as we're going through the underwriting process. So what that means is that money's sitting in cash. It's not generating any interest during that time period. And if we end up having to come to a no decision, that hurts. That means we've just sat on cash for several weeks not making any interest, and we're going to have to continue sitting on cash for several more weeks while we find and underwrite the next loan. So that's not a fun process, but I would say that I would rather have the cash than be in a bad loan where we're going to be dealing with that now for the next couple of years. So.
That's right. So this was an inside view of the last project that we looked at. In our business, we are on the lending side and we're also on the equity side. So if you have any questions and you enjoy this, we're kind of trying to give you more of an inside look of how our business operates. Ask questions. We would love to try to add value to what you're looking for in a real-time kind of example of what we're going through. So thank you guys, we appreciate you, and we'll see you on the next video.